Welcome to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kurt Woeller, talking with experts in functional and integrative health and medicine, discussing critical information for improving your health and wellness to help you live a long, full life. Let's get to it. Hi, this is Dr. Kurt Woeller. Welcome to the podcast. And in this discussion, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Pejman Kitiraei. Dr. Kitiraei is a DO, as I am, and we're going to talk about mold and mycotoxins, and this is an important conversation, and specifically talk about the exposure of mold, the exposure to mycotoxins, and something he'll bring up with regards to dampness in this discussion and how it relates to autism. So, Pejman, how are you?
I'm doing really well. Pleasure to be here, and really thank you for creating the space for us to have this discussion. Really looking forward to it.
So before we get started, give an overview of your education, your experience, and then really how you got involved in doing biomedical intervention, sometimes what we call integrative medicine for autism.
Yeah, so I did my residency at Loma Linda University. I did osteopathic school at Pacific Comp. So that was in Pomona. Did my residency at Loma Linda University, and that's when my eyes started opening up, and I started questioning a lot of things. Wonderful residency, incredible training, but I just had so many of these moments, and I'm sure you had them too, where I would just look at the case that, we were coming across, and, everyone would shrug their shoulders and say, well, this is all we can do. And, one of the most vivid cases that I had was this young guy, probably 14 years old, toxic megacolon. So he had inflammatory bowel disease, out of control inflammatory bowel disease. They put him on steroids, put him on the biologics. Everything had not been able to control his inflammation. So his colon had just ballooned out to, I think it was like 10 centimeters. It was huge. And since everything failed, the docs basically just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, the medical interventions are failing. So the next option is to cut out his colon. And in that moment, I was somehow the only person that looked at this and said, wait a second, this makes absolutely no sense. So you haven't talked about diet. You haven't talked about anything else outside of the medications. And because the medications aren't working, the next option is let's cut out this young person's colon. So the rest of his life, he's going to be without a colon, and that's okay. And I had many other experiences like this in residency that kept just having me look at the scenario and say, well, this isn't adding up. This just isn't making sense. And why is this not making sense? And that line of reasoning has been kind of if you want to say, continuous questioning that has taken me from one model to another. And it was what took me into holistic medicine. My wonderful program director was the person who's like, hey, Pejman, this holistic medicine stuff may be for you. And she was kind of into it. And, I did one conference, which then led to fellowship at the University of Arizona in integrative medicine. And then from there, training biomedical models and functional medicine and so forth. And the entire time, really, what has come up for me is with each model, even in the biomedical world, right? Like we have one way of seeing things. The functional medical model has one way of seeing things. And the entire time I've been, I guess, fascinated with how people tend to look at the information they get as almost like a tribe, right? People get attached to the ideas of what they are told and believe those ideas are all that there is. And for whatever weird reason, my brain just doesn't function in that way. And if an idea works and if the kids get better, great. If an idea doesn't work and the kids are still struggling, for me, it's like, well, what are we missing? And I guess part of the drive in my desire to help these kids is I have a lot of similarities to these kids. I probably fall somewhere on the spectrum. I have a lot of, autistic nuanced features, if you want to say. And I had a lot of challenges as a kid, a lot of anxiety, a lot of OCD, at some point suicidality. Like it was a not so pleasant experience. So when I see these kids struggling like there's a part of me that is re-experiencing my own childhood, which drives me as much as possible to, try to find answers and to help them to whatever extent I can.
So with regards to that, your own experience, what did you do? Was it something you felt you outgrew, or did you, when you started learning more about health and nutrition and started making changes to your diet or, various things that you did along the way? I mean, what made a change for you with regards to what you felt was happening with yourself?
There have been multiple kind of key, if you want to say, benchmarks or milestones. Early on, as most young adult teens, I was eating fast food, burgers and fries and soda, and didn't think anything of it because so did everyone else around me. And I felt awful. Lots of anxiety, lots of depression, but I thought that's what it was, and it was normal. But then I started, as I got into the world of holistic medicine, it's like, God, gluten and dairy and all this stuff is awful. Why am I eating it? So I cleaned up my diet, which helped me feel better. I found that I had a homocysteine of, I think, 18 initially. So I had massive errors in methylation, and, I'm homozygous MTHFR C677T. So I started supplementing, which helped me come out of my depression. I would say, single-handedly, the most impactful thing that I've ever done, and I tried B12 injections, I tried massive amounts of folate, pretty much any and every supplement that I've come across, I use it on myself, even sometimes before giving it to the kids. Single-handedly, the most impactful thing that ever happened to me over the last decade and a half of being in this world has been itraconazole. And I know we're going to touch on that. But the way it changed my nervous system, it has literally given me a new nervous system. The OCD, the anxiety, the sensory issues, the propensity to just overanalyze everything, getting into repetitive thought patterns that, would sometimes derail social interactions, which I thought was just kind of who I was. And with the itraconazole, it wasn't just those things substantially got better. My entire experience of the world also changed. Oxytocin started functioning, and I know you and I kind of chatted offline about this, about why that could be. The way I experienced dopamine, which is ultimately, reward. People do something and they feel a sense of reward, right? That was never happening for me. And when you look at a lot of these children on the spectrum, they have kind of a very flat demeanor, right? Even the kids that are, high functioning, or they're doing well and they've kind of come back from, severe autism. When I see these kids, a lot of them are kind of flat in their affect, which is kind of where I was. And now I realize, I never truly experienced reward the way normal people do. I would mentally be like, oh, I did this, I did whatever really cool. And, I would make myself be happy about it. Even love. I have a beautiful wife who is amazing. I have 2 kids that I adore to death. And obviously I love them. But the emotional experience of love, where your heart lights up in a way. And one of the things that's so fascinating is my wife is a highly social human being. And every time, I would pay her a compliment. She's like, you don't need it. I'm like, well, what do you mean? I need it. I love you. Or thank you. And she's like, you sound like a robot. You don't need it. And what I've come to realize is because oxytocin especially was really not firing in my head, that the tone of my voice, because the emotion wasn't behind it, this highly socially intelligent person would look at my, tonation and so forth and be like, well, his tone is not adding up. And she was right. The hormonal chemical experience behind the emotions that most normal people have were really not firing in my brain. And what's crazy is with itraconazole, within probably 4 weeks, the entire neurochemistry started changing, which is what I've seen in a lot of the kids. So as I've worked to help the kids, I've found ways to help myself.
That's amazing. Because we've talked about a lot of things, but I've not heard that part of your story with regards to itraconazole, personally with regards to oxytocin and how it, you feel affects your personality. We're going to get into that more, particularly when we talk about that particular medication specifically. But let's go into mold, mycotoxins, dampness. So what are your concerns with regards to mold exposure for the vast majority of special needs kids? I mean, you've touched on a lot now, but let's start there and we can build on this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think to start first, it's important to define what we mean by mold, right? And I appreciate what you touched on in the very beginning, which is dampness. So I think in our community, we do a disservice in saying mold because that just implicates just the mold spores, right? The actual mold, or maybe the mold toxins. But really, the reality is when there is a water event in a home, right? Too much humidity, rain, some kind of leak, something has happened to create too much humidity in the home. That excess humidity actually causes this soup of toxicity. And it's like a combination of sewage. Most people don't know what's in sewage, but sewage, actually, that smell is all of the microbial volatile compounds. So these bacteria, especially, and there's mold there too, they're excreting all of these compounds, these toxins, these gases, these little particulates, along with the mycotoxins, along with these bacterial lipopolysaccharides, which are basically bacterial toxins. So it's like having a chain smoker in your wall, except the smoke that's being excreted, sometimes people can't smell it. And it's basically a combination of sewage with some mold toxins, one of which especially has actually been used in biological warfare. So imagine like a biological warfare gas in low amounts with some sewage all being spewed out from the wall continuously. So when we say mold, really what we're talking about is this combination of really toxic gases that, anyone that studied them would argue is probably one of the most dangerous compounds that we can come across. My concern is when you look at the prevalence of this, on average, if you take very high-income communities in arid regions such as Southern California, parts of the desert, if you kind of level it all out, 1 in 3 individuals in the United States are being exposed to this soup of toxins. You get into flood-prone regions, you get into low-income households, that goes up to 1 in 2 individuals. So this isn't something that is rarely being encountered. It's not something that is a kind of infrequent thing. There's a lot of exposure that's happening, and we're missing it. We're missing it because most physicians have no idea how to identify it. Even holistic providers, for the most part, have no idea how to identify it. Most environmental experts miss it because a lot of these environmental, quote unquote, experts, they've taken a weekend course and they don't have actual certification. So they don't require, most states don't require these people to be certified. So they're not meeting any actual standard of care. So environmental expert goes and looks at the wall and says, well, I don't see a lot of water staining. They take literally one sample from an entire home and look at that sample, compare it to the garden, and literally say, well, garden has more mold. Forget about all the other stuff, which they're not measuring, right? Literally, they're just looking at the mold spores. So they say, well, the mold spores inside your house with one sample is less than the mold spores that I took from the outside, which is essentially the garden. Therefore, there is no mold in this house. And what the studies have told us is the microbial volatile compounds, particulates, et cetera, actually are about 200 to 500-fold higher than the mold spores in indoor environments, which we're completely ignoring because for the most part, the technology is not adequate in measuring all of these things. So we have these huge, essentially knowledge gaps in how we detect these things in the kiddos, in their environments, and people are just essentially flying blind, not seeing it, even though it's happening all the time. And then it's all of the toxicity and inflammation that this soup of toxins creates that's really the most terrifying part of it.
So do you feel it's the homes? I mean, are the homes today built in a way that things are much more closed up? We're not getting adequate ventilation. Is that perhaps the building material that is problematic? Maybe it's a combination of all that, because I've seen the exact same thing you're describing. They come out, they look at the house, they do one sample, and they do a sample outdoors, and they go, well, there's more stuff outside than indoors, so it's not a problem. And I mean, I have many experience with that with families where you've got a massive amount of mold behind a wall and maybe one little spot that's manifesting on the paint. And it's not until they drill in and sample it, or in one case they actually removed the wall, and there was Stachybotrys mold from the floor to the ceiling. But there was only one little spot on the outside of the wall in the room that was obvious. So what is your experience, and some of the professionals you've worked with, talked through your own research? Is it the modern home that seems to be a problem with regards to this?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. So, I mean, you look at sheetrock, gypsum board, drywall, whatever you want to call it, that's really come into our building techniques over the last 50 years. And the problem with sheetrock is basically we take a bunch of calcium carbonate and slap some paper on both sides of it, and we somehow were smart enough to put mold spores into literally that paper. So all drywall, literally, if you add water to drywall, it becomes a chia pet of dampness, with mold growing literally because it's already embedded into the matrix of the drywall. And then when you kind of fast forward and you say, well, that's been around 50 years, why is this becoming an issue now? Over the last 10 or 15 years, on top of building practices getting poorer, right? A lot of contractors are just trying to spit up buildings as fast as they can. So the quality of the build has gone down. But in addition, over the last 10 or 15 years, we have decided to prioritize energy efficiency, right? And how we do energy efficiency is by sealing the buildings as much as possible, right? The less air exchange there is the more insulation there is, the less energy we have to spend in heating or cooling the home, which also means we have now created these very tight closed-loop systems where these homes literally have no air exchange with outside. So all of this soup of toxins can now actually build up in these indoor environments, whereas 20 years ago, like I'm sure you remember, you close your window, there was like a quarter-inch gap, right? And there was just drafts, always constantly moving air through the home, which actually mitigated to some extent this exposure. You add to that what has happened to the human beings over the last also decade and a half, with the exponential increase in all of the chemicals, right? Air pollution, pesticides, plastic, metals, etc., the decrease in the quality of the food. What we have also done simultaneously is made the human beings, especially the children, far more susceptible, right? The microbiome health has gone down, the gut health has gone down, the mitochondria are not as resilient because of all of these toxins. So we have literally created this perfect soup or experiment, if you want to say, where on one hand, the human beings are much less resilient to handling these toxins, and simultaneously we have ramped up the exposure to these toxins. And then you add to that climate change, right? And there's more flooding, more water events than there's ever been in the history of this country and, frankly, the world. And it's just a perfect disaster unfolding right underneath your eyes.
So from your experience, as a pediatrician working with many, many kids over the years, so, we talk about the soup, or you're talking about the soup, which I think is fantastic because that's kind of the way I've seen it too. But I never thought of it from the standpoint of dampness, and I like the fact that you brought that into the conversation. But typically you've got mold, mycotoxins, volatile organic compounds, for example. What would let's just break it into quick categories. if somebody was going to classically react to a mold as opposed to a mycotoxin, as opposed perhaps to a volatile organic compound, can you think about specific symptoms and what they might experience with each of those exposures? And I realize it's a soup in reality, but to sort of help the listener sort of conceptualize, or even from a conventional medical standpoint, in the way they look at allergy, for example, because they could be reacting to these things all at the same time, but sort of breaking into individual categories from a symptom standpoint. What's been your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of good literature around this, which is, I think, one of the wonderful things that's happening right now. There's a lot of research going into all of this. So, I mean, if you look at the molds specifically, right, Aspergillus, Penicillium, Cladosporium, Stachybotrys, really, Stachy itself is a very heavy, mold that actually doesn't really circulate into the air. So exposure to Stachybotrys itself as a mold doesn't really happen because that mold just kind of flops down to the ground and most people don't have exposure. Aspergillus, Cladosporium in particular, and to some extent Penicillium, are generally, they create more inflammation and allergy reactions. So you get the congestion, you get some of the allergy symptoms. And they've actually done some animal studies where they took mice, for instance, and they put these poor little mice in chambers and then just flooded the chamber with Aspergillus spores. And they said, well, what's going to happen? And there was a lot of pulmonary inflammation. So these mice develop pulmonary inflammation, which, then you get into these weird rabbit holes of the lung-gut axis, right? So all of the human systems are connected. And even though Aspergillus, for instance, triggers inflammation in the airways as its primary kind of mechanism, right? It induces eosinophils and induces some allergy reactions. That allergy reaction in the sinuses and airways actually has been shown to impact the microbiome in a very negative way. So even though the molds don't directly get into the gut to cause inflammation for the most part, and we can get into colonization later, through direct, or I guess you can say more indirect mechanisms, they cause inflammation, but then that inflammation then affects other organ systems, which then changes things like the gut function. Mycotoxins are rather concerning because what they do is on a whole other class. So mycotoxins behave more like particulates. And if you can look at particulates as like dust that just travels everywhere within the home. So they travel a lot further. And mycotoxins, first and foremost, can trigger gnarly amounts of inflammation in the nervous system. So they can trigger mast cell activation within the gut and the nervous system, which can then change weird patterns like sensory findings. So when we look at, for instance, especially in the children, what causes them to be hyper sensitive to the environment, right? That auditory sensitivity. And then, a lot of times these kids have weird motor planning issues where, they're clumsy and they fall and they run into things. And then they have, tactile sensitivity. They can't handle clothing. The restrictive eating that they have, where they are very particular about textures and their appetite centers are all off. All of these, at least in my experience, sensory findings and appetite changes are all due to mast cells, because the mast cells release histamine because of the mycotoxin. And histamine actually changes a lot of this directly. And then the mycotoxins also change a lot of the appetite centers. And there are several studies that have shown that. So kind of this anorexia phenomenon that we see in these children could all be from the mycotoxins. Mycotoxins also trigger microglial activation, and there are a lot of good studies on that. So direct inhalation of the mycotoxins can also cause the microglia to become activated. And we find in children with autism, weird things like what causes the changes in the neuroplasticity, what causes a lot of the aggression, the irritability, disruption in the blood-brain barrier. All of that is an inflammatory response, which these mycotoxins can induce through multiple different mechanisms. And then that's on top of mycotoxins can disrupt the gut integrity, right? So they can induce essentially leaky gut or induce intestinal permeability. They can trigger gut inflammation. They can also disrupt the microbiome through primary and secondary mechanisms. And then we get into systemic inflammation. They also can trigger mitochondrial abnormalities, if you want to say. They can disrupt the electron transport chain. They hit multiple systems at once, which is what makes them really concerning. And this is just the mycotoxins. And then there are the microbial volatile compounds, which we're still learning a lot about. I think in comparison to the literature that's in the sphere of mycotoxins, the microbial volatile compounds are less well understood. But what we do know is that they are extremely pro-inflammatory. So I know that you touched on this many a times. Microbial particulates can activate toll-like receptors. Bacterial endotoxins can activate the toll-like receptors, which can then induce massive cascades of inflammation within the nervous system and the body. These are the things that I've at least learned, and I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these, bacterial particulates and compounds and so forth.
So when you're talking about microbial organic volatile compounds, so that would be things like lipopolysaccharide, for example.
Yes.
Okay. So, and that would absolutely link into the toll-like receptor, mechanisms, trigger inflammation. So you get those receptors that are part of the innate immune system that recognize these different, molecular patterns, these different chemical compounds, and then you get intracellular reactivity downstream that triggers some type of reaction. Most of the time, it's a pro-inflammatory reaction. So let's look at. I want to expand a little bit on the discussion of fungal toxins, gut permeability, mast cell activation, microglia activation. Give the listener a little bit of just an overview on how the gut is connected to the brain is connected to the gut with regards to these systems, and what you've seen in clinical practice when you either have a child that has mold exposure or you suspect it happening. Because I think you broke it down pretty nice with regards to some of the sensory issues, speech problems, etc. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the problem of fungal toxins perhaps in the gut, and that could just be a colonization of mold in the digestive tract. How does it trigger a mast cell reaction systemically throughout the body? And specifically, how would it trigger a microglia reaction of something coming from the gut?
Great question. Are you okay if we run down the rabbit hole a little bit here?
Absolutely. Go for it.
So, I want to first start with, I really came to this conclusion because I had so many kids, and this is, when I was still relatively naive to mold. So there wasn't this inherent bias to look at things in this way. But I just had, and I'm sure you've had a lot of these kids, where I just would look at their gastrointestinal tract function, and it was just the weirdest scenario I would see. There was just so much gut inflammation, so much dysbiosis. A lot of them had candida overgrowth. And, we would get rid of gluten and dairy, we would do some probiotics, and nothing would really change. Right? It was just this odd scenario where these kids had so much gut inflammation and so much dysfunction and dysbiosis that it just made absolutely no sense. So I kept asking them, what the heck is it about these kids? Like, what is happening to these kids that's creating this? And this is part of what led me down this road of mold. And it turns out that the kids who have had significant exposure to mold, at least in my experience, have some of the most damaged and really dysfunctional gastrointestinal tracts that I've ever seen. So when the mycotoxins are inhaled, they go through our bloodstream, and they actually, through the bloodstream, come in essentially through the back end into the gastrointestinal tract. And there are several studies that have shown that when this happens, they can induce a significant amount of inflammation and intestinal permeability or leaky gut simultaneously. So the tight junction proteins that essentially are there to glue the gut together, right? The tight junction proteins are disrupted. Their genetic expression is disrupted, And then simultaneously, you're getting at least the mast cells activated. We're not sure if directly the dendritic cells are activated, but the mast cells get activated because of this blood linkage to the mycotoxin. So you've got immune activation, you've got leaky gut. When the mast cells are activated, they start dumping out a lot of histamine in the gut. And what we do know is that histamine causes more damage in the gut. The mast cells themselves can cause more damage in the gut. That histamine also starts revving up the dendritic cells, which then activates more sophisticated layers of gut immune activation. So you get this disturbing, vicious cycle that just kind of takes on a life of its own. As all of this is happening, it turns inflammation in the gut and immune dysregulation in the gut. So the mycotoxins, while they activate inflammation, they also actually disrupt immunoglobulin production in the gut. They actually suppress it. And this combination becomes a perfect scenario for further disruption to the microbiome. So if you look at the mycotoxins, now we're going to shift for a second to the bacteria. So lots of gut inflammation, leaky gut. The mycotoxins themselves have antimicrobial effects. Like if you very simplistic kind of look, penicillin came from penicillium, right? A lot of these mycotoxins have direct antimicrobial effects. What we don't always realize is it's not really the direct, I don't believe, the direct antimicrobial effect that creates the mess in the microbiome. It's what these mycotoxins do to the environment. And the best analogy I can give, to our listeners is imagine your gardener came to your lawn, right? You have got this beautiful lawn, you love it, you work on it every day, you water it, you fertilize it, except your gardener comes and every day just literally pours some acid in the lawn. And you look at your lawn, you're like, I don't understand why all my grass is dying, but there are all of these weeds that are resistant to that grass that are popping up, right? Dandelions and, everything else that you don't want there. And you keep trying to fertilize it, you keep trying to water it, except day by day, your lawn just continues to die and all the weeds continue to spread. The inflammation and dysfunction that these mycotoxins induce in the gut is like the equivalent of someone pouring acid on your lawn. At a certain point, what we have learned is inflammation actually distorts the microbiome. So the beneficial bacteria, the lactobacilli, the bifidobacters, etc., while they do control the immune system, more so they are influenced by the gut immune system. And all of these beneficial bacteria literally start dying off many a times because of that inflammation. And simultaneously, Clostridium, Candida, etc., all actually become activated. It's really amazing. And I'm sure you've seen some of this. All of these microbes, they're highly intelligent. They're constantly sensing their environment. These are not static little organisms that are just sitting there. So these really intelligent, microorganisms actually are sensing their environment and like, oh my God, this is the perfect time for me to start raiding things because that my environment is falling apart. This is the time that I can actually do damage. So the beneficial bacteria are gone. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that's interesting about that you just brought up, I often talk about, like in the organic acid training that I've done, we talk about Clostridia, talk about Candida and some of these other organisms. And people get frustrated sometimes because they took an antifungal for a month and it didn't get rid of their Candida. They took a probiotic for a while. And the comment I've always had is these things have their own intrinsic desire to thrive and survive. They're not just waiting around to be killed by supplements or medications that we prescribe. So they are very sophisticated. The biology of these things goes back billions of years through our own evolution. And so they're part of the ecosystem of our planet, and they are part of the ecosystem of our body. One of the things, Pejman, I wanted to bring up was you mentioned this entire reaction occurring by breathing in mycotoxins, right? So you're breathing in the mycotoxins. It gets into general circulation. that blood is circulating all throughout the body, and it's actually influencing the immune function, the structural integrity of the digestive system from within. It's not, there is another scenario where you could actually have mold colonizing the digestive system, something that we see quite commonly in the organic acid test. And the mold that is colonizing the digestive system could be producing its own mycotoxins that would be interfering or disrupting structural integrity of the mucosal lining from within the lumen of the gut. Because the point that I wanted to help the listener with is you're talking about a mechanism where you're actually breathing in the mycotoxins at first, and it's essentially circulating throughout the body, having this internal disruption, not just entirely manifesting from within the lumen of the digestive system. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, you said it perfectly, and I'm really grateful that you touched on that because, I think here's an analogy that I can try to give to the listeners. It's like having a very poor contractor that's coming into your house and they're causing all kinds of damage, and they're kind of whacking the walls, and then they suddenly rupture your gas line. And it wasn't intentional, but they were causing some damage to the walls. They were causing some damage to the floor. Now they rupture the gas line, and then next thing you know, your house explodes. The explosion, the true damage that comes to play, to your point, is actually a secondary phenomenon that is really a result of these mycotoxins. So it's like these mycotoxins erode the gut, erode the gut, erode the gut, erode the gut. Gut integrity falls apart, the microbiome starts degrading, so the beneficial bacteria are no longer really there in the sufficient amounts to control everything else. And now you've got these secondary actors, bad actors, if you want to say, that come into the picture. If you look at Aspergillus, for instance, I actually hunted down every microbiome specialist I could find. So these are geeks that just focus on the fungus in the gut, right? These are like people that they only care about fungus, right? And it's only the fungus in our gut. So I started tracking these people down, and I kept asking them, like, well, we're seeing Aspergillus colonize. And they're like, no, that's not possible. Aspergillus does not colonize the gut. But there's a statement that comes, a normal, healthy gut. So all of the studies that have been done are on normal, healthy adult guts, and it's absolutely true. In normal, healthy adult guts, Aspergillus doesn't colonize, which then, brought up this other question, which is like, well, if that's the case, then what the heck is different about these kids? Because to your point, we see it all the time, this colonization. And that takes us to this environment. So it's like the dandelion lawn analogy. When there's inflammation, when there's mast cell activation, when the microbiome starts really falling apart, I believe that creates literally the perfect milieu or environment. So now Aspergillus, which we all have, literally every person on this planet has like a tiny bit of Aspergillus in their gut, just from being out in the world, eating stuff. It's constantly getting in our gut. When we have this distortion, now Aspergillus and I believe Clostridium and Candida, which we also all have, become really bad actors. And what you said was perfect. They now actually start creating their own supertoxins. They all directly trigger inflammation. So Aspergillus actually can trigger huge amounts of inflammation, which has been tied to the onset of food allergies and food sensitivity. So when we look at a lot of these kids, they have countless food allergies, countless food sensitivities, right? Where does that all come from? That's all the gut immune system being improperly activated by these yeast in particular. So it's a really great question you brought up.
So one other thing I wanted to mention about the gardener, not much of a gardener if he's coming out pouring acid on your lawn, but the way I think of it is these organisms, not all of them, of course, but the common things that we're exposed to them because they are part of planet Earth, and we're part of planet Earth, and we're exposed to these things, maybe not on a continual basis, But certainly, the food we consume, the water, the different environments, it's known that family members tend to have very similar microbiomes, the pets that you own, the different things you're exposed to. And so the gardener didn't come out and throw a bunch of weed seeds on your lawn. He poured acid on your lawn. So he's basically destroyed the ecosystem of the lawn, and the weeds that were there, those things were already there. But a healthy lawn kept them in check. It kept things in balance. But once the lawn and the soil was disrupted, the weeds that were already present now had a chance to become opportunistic. And that's the way I look at the digestive system too. People go, well, how did I get Clostridia difficile? How did I get Candida? How did I get such and such? And it's because these things are a normal part, in essence, maybe a very small percentage of the backdrop of our microbiome. But it's when the microbiome as a whole becomes disrupted and those other more prolific normal bacteria and the influence they have on the immune system and vice versa, that's when these things become problematic. So another question I wanted to ask you is, where does the discussion with regards to parasites, Clostridia, viruses, we could get into things like heavy metals and all of these, when you assess the autistic kids that you've seen over the past many years, clearly mold, mycotoxin, dampness exposure is a big problem. How much of these other entities do you feel are a significant factor? Maybe they're a mild factor, or maybe they're just a selective factor in a few. But how would you sort of break that down as far as the prevalence of issues of some of these other problems?
So, with parasites, in these kids, I think they're a major contributor to the inflammation they have. And a lot of families have found that when they put their kids on an anti-parasitic regimen, they're more calm, they're sleeping better, etc. Now, if you flip this conversation around and say, well, how many kids in the world or even in this country have parasites in them and they're not becoming autistic? It's like, well, God, like blastocystis hominis, some of these parasites are so common that if you go on the CDC website, it says they're normal, right? It's like they're so common that the CDC doesn't even consider them a parasite in a sense. But this is where, again, this environmental piece comes in, right? The parasites didn't create the problem. It's when the gastrointestinal tract fell apart that now the parasites have become one more provocative agent, right? It's the same thing with food. There are people that can eat gluten and dairy all day and nothing happens to them. They don't become autistic. They don't become angry. They're fine. But when you have a gastrointestinal tract that's really, really susceptible, now gluten, dairy, et cetera, are all issues. Same thing with the parasites. They trigger a lot of mast cell activation. They can trigger a lot of neuroinflammation. But that's in the backdrop of the gut that's very susceptible. I think when you look at heavy metals, which are obviously a problem, it's a similar kind of conversation. There are people that can swim in soups of metals and nothing happens to them. It's when the blood-brain barrier gets compromised, right, that becomes an issue. It's when the gastrointestinal tract loses its integrity, the detoxification pathways start falling apart. And now you've got one more toxic burden on top of the total toxic load, which keeps these kids stuck. When it comes to viruses, for me, there are times the viruses absolutely can trigger inflammation. But then when we ask, well, how many people have had CMV? How many people have had EBV? How many people have had a lot of these viruses? Pretty much the entire population has been exposed, right? I stopped checking for CMV and EBV antibodies because every single child I had it for the most part. What part of the immune system, or if we look at it in a different way, just to keep it really simple, what keeps these viruses in check if everyone has had it? It's our immune system, right? The immune system essentially keeps these viruses in check and does not allow them to get out of control to cause problems when the immune system is healthy. When you have this total cascade of events, you also get distortions in the immune system. So on one hand, our ability to control the viruses, and I believe even COVID spike proteins, they fit into this picture, and that ultimately creates the susceptibility for a lot of the issues that we see with the viruses. So it's all kind of going back to that analogy that you gave. The seeds to the lawn were always, the weeds were always there. All of these things are there. It's what happens to the system as a whole that essentially causes the human body to be incapable of managing and handling all of these different challenges that it's facing, that then causes these other things to become a problem.
When I look back in my career, Pejman, I think I told you in the past, and we've corresponded, my first introduction to somebody who was really, really sick from mold exposure was when I was practicing in Southern California. And I forget what year it was, early 2000s. So I was maybe 4 or 5 years into practice. And this woman came to me who was really sick, kind of, it wasn't a lethal thing. She just was unbelievable brain fog, body pain, fatigue. It turned out that she was being exposed to mold in her condominium complex. In fact, she was in the middle of a lawsuit suing the condominium complex. And I had done a immunological test at that time in California, and it looked at aspergillus and penicillium, and I forget some other markers. It was very controversial at the time, but her test was so unbelievably high and positive from an immunological reaction standpoint to mold. We didn't have mycotoxin testing back then as far as urine assessment. But the thing that it impressed upon me as a young doctor at that time was how sensitive she was to other things. She was very sensitive to foods. She was very sensitive to perfumes. She was very sensitive to deodorants. She was very sensitive to the smell of gasoline. All of these things could completely lay her out for a couple days of just walking into a drugstore where you had scented, perfumes or whatever that was in the air. So, and I've seen that over the years with other individuals with mold exposure. There's something about mold and mycotoxins and these volatile organic compounds that just super sensitize the body to other types of things. With many of the autistic kids, because they can't talk, they can't express themselves, their sensitivities, and you would, I'm sure I've seen this as well, seem to sort of spill out in other ways. Self-stimulatory behavior, aggressive behavior, self-injurious behavior, for example, odd types of behaviors. So I've often wondered about that. And are these kids sort of expressing these other types of behaviors and symptoms where if they could actually tell you how they felt, they'd be like, well, yeah, I'm reacting to the deodorant, or, the laundry detergent is giving me a headache. So I'm assuming you've seen the same kinds of things, or maybe had some suspicions of it in your practice, but that's just been my experience.
No, I have. I think you bring up such an important point, and this is the part that's heartbreaking to me, because we see these kids struggling. We see these kids completely overwhelmed. The ones that can use lettered boards. The things that they express. My world is shattered. I'm destroyed. Overwhelmed. Life is like a battle zone for them. When they're out in the world, and sometimes not even when they're in their own homes, like their lives are falling apart, and it's almost like every day they're getting tortured in some way. And to your point, the only way they're able to express themselves is by having all of these very concerning and odd behaviors. But I'm guessing sometimes there's less pain in banging your head against the wall than what you're feeling inside. So I 100% agree with you that this is probably what's driving this. And this is where I believe, the root of all of these odd and challenging behaviors, including what keeps these kids from being able to connect, is inflammation, period. Ultimately, yes, the toxicity is driving that inflammation, but inflammation is where a lot, if not all of these behaviors and the inability to connect come from. And I've seen this happen, countless times where I control the inflammation, we control the environment, we do a few things to really get that dialed in. All of the behaviors are gone. Sleep improves, appetite improves. And now you've got a child that's actually wanting to connect. They're connecting with their siblings. They're connecting with their family. They're connecting with other kids in school. They're able to be in school. They're not overwhelmed by all of the sensory experience. And it's all inflammation.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is incredibly important, because it is an inflammatory problem. I mean, look at the studies going back with regards to neuroinflammation. I still see things going on today, just in the past couple of years, talking about different pro-inflammatory cytokines. We know about inflammasome activation, just from an inflammatory standpoint, coming from the gut and the brain, back and forth. And so that could be anything that drives inflammation: food reactions, glyphosate, chemicals, mold, the dampness, the microbial soup, vaccine reactions. And these things can, I think, in some cases, have a synergistic influence, unfortunately, negative influence. They sort of compound the problem. We're going to talk about treatment and get into some of the unique aspects of Sporanox and some other things in part 2 of this interview. I want to wrap up this part 1 aspect of this interview, Pejman, by laboratory testing. So, big area. We know that there's a lot of tests out there that the autism community is using, other special needs kids as well. But specifically with regards to mold mycotoxins assessment, we can talk about the organic acid test, your experience with that, urine mycotoxin, blood antibody testing. Give just sort of an overview of how you approach mold assessment, mycotoxin assessment from a testing standpoint in your practice.
Sure, absolutely. So I think the most important place to start over here is for everyone to realize how not advanced we are in this area. We're living in the 21st century, but our technology, as good as it is, it's kind of like in the Stone Ages. And I think this is one of the things that a lot of physicians and patients don't realize. They do a test, they take those results at face value and say, oh, well, this test is normal, therefore this isn't the problem. Even the very, very best tests miss this toxic soup in all of the consequences 20% of the time. This is the really, really good blood tests. For me, I always start with realizing that I can only rely on my tests so much, because I've seen literally every test fail. And sometimes, I've had a few cases where I look at the test, I'm like, I don't think this is mold. But it just happened that the family did an environmental test, this thing called the dust test that I like. And then that dust test comes screaming back with like horrific amounts of Stachybotrys, so forth, where it's like, gosh, we got to get the heck out of this home. So I think it's first important to start with this realization, because that is one of the things that I don't see discussed enough. Everyone talks about all of the good and positive sides of all of the tests. And it's not that I don't use the tests, but I think it's important to start with what are the limitations of these tests. So one of the foundational pieces of how I assess is, presuming we can get blood, I always do blood testing as one of the foundations, because I think urine testing, and we'll talk about the organic acids and so forth in a second, I find urine testing to be only so reliable, whereas blood testing could be very informative. The things that I rely on the most, which you touched on, are ultimately checking to see if the immune system has at some point in time encountered either the mold spores or the mold toxins. So there's a company called MyMicroLab, which actually checks for immune reactions against the mold toxins. I do think that that's a very good test. I have found that in little kids, let's say 2 to 6 to 7 years of age, their immune reactivity towards the toxins is not as robust as the adults. And their reference ranges are really set more for adults. So therefore, sometimes you get a test that doesn't look terrible, even though the exposure is there. I'd say that happens maybe also about that kind of 20% of the time. In older kids, the accuracy goes up to closer to 10%, meaning 10% of the time it gives a false negative, 90% of the time it is fairly accurate. And typically we don't see false positives, meaning the child wasn't exposed, but they have the immune reaction. So it's a generally accurate test. The other test that I use a lot is basically immune reactions against the molds directly, which I have seen be fairly accurate in little and older kids. The problem is that the specificity is a little less, right? Because child could be in an outdoor environment, they're getting exposed to mold, because they're in an outdoor preschool or whatever, and the immune reaction you're seeing is from that, not from inside. There's a company called Alletess, Allettess, and they have a basic mold panel, which is about $200, which is one of my go-tos. The thing that stands out for me on that test is, so they check IgE, which is the allergy piece, the IgG, which is the delayed immune response, and IgA, which is what I think of as more of a mucosal immune reaction. And where this test is handy is usually the IgE is almost always negative. So for any family who has worked with a physician, they're like, sure, I'll do mold testing, except the testing that they're doing is the IgE allergy component. So there are studies out there that have shown that is positive only about 5, maybe 10% of the time when these kids are exposed. So for people who are just relying on those, you're missing 90% of the exposure. The IgG of Alletess is helpful because it's checking to see if there's been a delayed immune reaction, including against Stachybotrys, which typically doesn't show up as an intense reaction, but when there is any immune reaction against Stachybotrys, it's like, well, where the heck is that Stachybotrys coming from? Because Stachy, the typical black mold that we talk about, which happens to be very toxinogenic and produces a lot of toxins, that mold only grows inside indoor environments, period. It does not like heat. It does not like being dry. It's very finicky. It's like the person who only goes to the most perfect spa, right? Because everything has to be just right. Stachybotrys is exactly the same way. It's very finicky, so it doesn't like being outdoor environment. So when it grows, it's usually in an indoor environment. And then on top of that,
the other thing too, by the way, real quick, Pejman, about Stachybotrys is it typically needs a lot of water, a lot of dampness, so it needs a continual source of exposure. The other thing you mentioned early on was that it doesn't travel very far. So it just sort of falls kind of to its local area. So if it's actually being picked up on an immune system test, to me, that would indicate that it is quite a problem and is in circulation throughout the house somehow, unless it's being known to be isolated to a specific room. So the Stachybotrys reaction from an immunological standpoint would be very concerning by the things you just mentioned.
Yeah. And that's why, for me, even a tiny reaction is a reaction that requires further investigation. And then when I see IgA reactions on the Alletess, usually for me, it's like, gosh, now we have, more significant gastrointestinal compromise because this mold is interacting with some kind of mucosal lining. It could be the sinuses, it could be the airways, it could be the gut, but somewhere along the way that the mucous membranes have now probably encountered this, and maybe there's some colonization driving that. So that is the mold testing. There's a guy named Dr. Shoemaker, who was one of the grandfathers of kind of, mold medicine. One of the biomarkers that Shoemaker really talked about, and there's multiple, is MMP9, matrix metalloproteinase 9. Why I come to gravitate towards that as one of the markers is insurance almost always covers it. It's not hard to draw, whereas some of his other ones, like you have to draw them a certain way, spin it down, and over time, like so many patients have difficulty that I stop. So MMP9 is basically a very oversimplified explanation. It's an enzyme that is looking for how much tissue repair is happening. So when there's tissue damage, MMP9 essentially starts increasing. And it turns out that tends to be fairly correlative with mold exposure because it causes a lot of tissue damage. So the higher the MMP9, typically the more likely there is of exposure. And there have been times where the mold antibodies look completely normal, but MMP9 was just screaming. And the cutoff is generally about 380, and like some of the kids are like 900, 1,000, which is usually suggestive of exposure. And then with that, I do basic blood work, check for iron deficiency, zinc deficiency, thyroid dysfunction, thyroid antibodies, because sadly about 10% of kids who have been exposed are having thyroid antibodies, some with frank Hashimoto's, which is another can of worms. I do a lot of checking of the gut immune system. So there's Cyrex2. There's a company called KBMO, which has a finger prick gut integrity test. I also use basically the antibodies against brewer's yeast, which they typically use for colitis as another marker. And why I've come to like this test a lot is essentially, if we're asking, is the gut integrity compromised, and is there a lot of yeast driving that immune activation? This ASCA antibodies, the anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibodies, are actually really good at answering that, because it turns out that Candida, at the very least, possibly Aspergillus, can also trigger this because there's a lot of immune or antigenic crossover. So essentially what these, conventional tests through the regular lab can say, yep, the gut is compromised. Yep, there's probably some kind of yeast imbalance driving it. And we're able to see this on the blood work.
Which, by the way, is one of the reasons personally I'm not opposed, but a little hesitant in the autism population of pushing Saccharomyces boulardii supplementation too high, is the potential cross-reactivity with the Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And I've seen that clinically. There were been some studies you mentioned about inflammatory bowel disease, particularly in Crohn's disease, for example, where there's, an issue with that. So that's just kind of a side note. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, as we wrap up part one here. But
I absolutely believe that these probiotics, are actually problematic for these kids. Dr. Joe Christa, one of my friends early on, was the one that was kind of raising the flag on Saccharomyces boulardii. And as I started paying attention, it's like, oh gosh, no, a lot of kids are actually getting more triggered by these probiotics. And I found this to be more or less across the board with a lot of different probiotics. So when you have a really unstable gut immune response, that gut immune response, it's like a blithering drunk that's, the wind blows the wrong way and they start screaming at the wind. You're like, what are you screaming at? You have a very unstable immune system. So the less you put into the gut, the better off you are. Another example is about 50-60% of the supplements out there have citric acid. Citric acid, which is one of the inactive ingredients, which is commonly found in these supplements, is actually a derivative of Aspergillus. So immunologically, citric acid looks a heck of a lot like Aspergillus. So while we're giving supplements to support detox and do this and do that, what we're actually doing is triggering the immune system that we're trying to calm down by accidentally introducing this ingredient or compound.
Yeah, it fantastic information. Pejman, thank you so much for participating in this interview, this part one interview. We're going to pick up this conversation going into treatment, looking at different remedies and binders and other discussions with regards to things to do when we're dealing with mold, mycotoxin, dampness exposure. So thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for hosting this conversation.
You've been listening to the Functional Medicine Doc Talk podcast with Dr. Kurt Woeller. For more information about this podcast, go to functionalmedicinedoctalk.com.